It's the taboo. It's the taboo, basically of all time.
Yeah, of all time.
But right now, there are a few more taboos. We knocked off the taboo against sex.
You did, personally.
Drugs, of course. Remember how upset society got about drugs? And still is. War on drugs. We certainly know about that taboo.
The next thing is death.
Everybody has deep thoughts about death. The ultimate taboo.
They blew open this world, this psychedelic world. I mean, it ended the 1950s.
It was all up for grabs. It's hard to describe what that felt like.
Leary and Alpert were remembered as cultural icons of the 60s especially, and very influential people in not only American culture, but world culture.
You know, they are iconic figures who stepped off the map. They really paid heavily.
The use of psychedelic drugs such as marijuana, mescaline, LSD is out of control in the United States today.
Oh, I knew he was an outlaw.
You have to be quite a badass to get locked up for your ideas.
We had a deep, deep friendship, but we also had a deep enmity.
We're all going to die. Why not learn how to do it with class and style and friendship as the climactic expression of a life?
What Ram Dass did for our culture was to open up a door of spirituality by having surrendered so completely to love.
When you walked in, there was a flash of total joy.
Yeah, me too.
And love, I don't know the words are, but...
See, in my mythology now, I'd say you and I are connected at a place where we've both danced through this incarnation together, but that we have a connection that is timeless in another sense of that, and like we're old beings that know each other well through many forms.
I think my incarnation is wonderful. I mean, I started out a Jewish boy from Boston, from psychology to psychedelics to Eastern mysticism, and then have ended up Ram Dass, just getting straight on towards God.
Who are you? Who am I? It's a very difficult question. Throughout my life, I've always been fascinated by where the action was. I never wanted to have power, but I wanted to... I ran for governor once against Ronald Reagan. I wanted to experience the different theaters or stages or viewpoints of life. I think I've lived one of the most interesting lives of anyone in the 20th century.
In the summer of 1995, Timothy Leary announced to the world media that he'd been diagnosed with inoperable prostate cancer. He was dying.
It's shocking that people aren't expected to talk about their dying or to plan it. Certainly, the greatest adventure, celebration of your life should be the process of moving on.
He turned it into a theater piece. He turned it into a poem. He turned it into a dance, which is just what he did with all the rest of his life. It was a celebratory moment.
Living's a team sport. Dying's a team sport. Be open to new ideas. Remember when people used to say that LSD is an escapist drug?
Yeah, I understand.
You know, one thing LSD is dangerous because you can't escape.
Confrontation.
You got 100 billion neurons.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. And death, my thing about death is not escaping it. I'm running towards Miss Death. You can't turn this over to the doctors. You can't turn it over to the priests. You can't turn it over to the medical profession. Think for yourselves.
No government agency or no profession can solve these problems for you. I've got to do it for myself, you've got to do it for yourself, And all the viewers have got to do it for themselves.
Take charge of it. Plan it. Talk to your friends about it.
Timothy Leary, born October 22nd, 1920, in Springfield, Massachusetts, an only child.
He took birth into such an interesting tension in terms of, on his mother's side, very conservative Irish Catholic, very tight, held in tight, very judgmental. His father was a dentist, but from the Learys, who were kind of a wild, Irish drinking, divorcing, going off and running away type family.
I was a heavy reader as a child, and I spent hours and hours as a kid studying the heroic and the interesting and the adventures of people who were thinking.
Timothy had an extraordinarily complex mind, subtle mind. He liked the kind of multi-level nature of consciousness a lot. I mean, the fact that James Joyce was one of his favorite writers is certainly a key, a clue. And he was the romantic Irish bard, also the kind of itinerant scholar, the kind of rascally person at the bar. And he seemed to play the role of a bad guy.
As Aldous Huxley said of him, the good Dr. Leary would serve our cause and his own better if he could resist his impulse to cock snooks at authority. There was a thing in Tim that just liked to piss people off.
What he was at heart was an Irish rebel.
But like a good Irishman, he could just pull tricks out of the bag. And he did it continually.
He had a twinkle in his eye and seemed leprechaunish and mischievous.
Timothy's paternal grandfather advised him to find your own way, be one of a kind. He acted on that guidance, questioning authority every chance he got. Following in his father's footsteps, Leary was a genial hellraiser as a young man. At West Point, he was court-martialed for supplying liquor to other cadets. Eventually, he was cleared of the charge and left the academy. Caught between the Catholic desire to please and a rebellious nature that ran deep, Tim spent his life walking the edge between conformity and chaos.
It's interesting, the things that happen. He gets thrown out of college for being found in a girls' dormitory. He gets given jail sentence for originally 40 years, and it was then reduced to 10 for, a half an ounce of grass. And there was a thing about Timothy about right and wrong, that he was busy being a bad boy, but in the rascally sense, the playful sense. Timothy was not mean-spirited. He was absolutely quite the opposite.
Richard Alpert, born April 6, 1931, in Boston, Massachusetts. His father, George Alpert, was president of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, co-founder of Brandeis University, and a trustee of the synagogue the family attended. Studying psychology, Dick earned his master's from Wesleyan and a PhD at Stanford. He taught on the faculties of both Stanford and UC Berkeley. Then, in 1958, he was appointed assistant professor at Harvard, a hometown success at the age of 27.
I kept a front because I'd be scorned. You just didn't talk about homosexuality. I mean, my prep school, oh boy, I went through hell internally.
Part of it is the privilege that he was brought into. Part of it is the era. It might be a key variant in his life that made him really move into the position of an outlier.
My homosexuality set the stage for feeling like an outcast.
Who am I to you? In projection.
Well, you are, we don't have the words for it, but I'd say something like soulmate or good friend and long-term friend, and I want to expose this man. When we met, it's true that I'd read more of the books, but you were 10 times more streetwise than I was when we met.
Really?
You
Really?
know that.
I always think of myself as kind of a nebbish, you know, lost soul. That you very square, and you picked me up.
Yeah.
I mean, you helped me.
But you were also a very scared Jewish boy that wanted to...
Yes, I was also that.
When people ask me what's the major discovery about myself or my life, it's the confidence to think for myself and to explore.
During the war, Leary completed his bachelor's in psychology and was posted at the Army Medical Corps Hospital in Pennsylvania. There, Tim met his first wife, Mary Ann. They were married in 1945. He then got his master's in psychology at Washington State. In 1946, they moved to San Francisco and started a family. Leary earned his PhD and began clinical research at UC Berkeley. There, he developed a definitive test for personality assessment and was published widely in respected journals. The American Psychological Association named his first book, The Interpersonal Diagnosis of Personality, its book of the year. Both Leary and Mary Ann were heavy drinkers, and Mary Ann suffered from severe depression. She committed suicide in 1955 on the morning of Tim's 35th birthday, after hearing that he had been having an affair. Mary Ann's death haunted Tim for the rest of his life. In 1958, dissatisfied with psychology, which had a success rate he thought no better than chance, Leary moved with his two children, Susan and Jack, to Florence, Italy. There, he met David McClellan, the director of the Harvard Center for Personality Research. Leary explained that he wanted to throw out the old doctor-patient model for psychological study and get involved with his subjects in real-life situations. McClellan was impressed.
Leary was the brightest psychologist, but Harvard lured him away by offering him a 3-year research project.
That summer, Timothy Leary ate psychoactive mushrooms for the first time in Cuernavaca, Mexico. They were offered to him by a visiting East German anthropologist who had heard of their use among the Aztecs.
And said, here, take these. They're interesting.
Over the next 4 hours, he journeyed through his inner landscapes and came back a changed man. Leary later told Albert that he had learned more about the mind in 4 hours than he had in his 15 years as a psychologist. It was 1960, and he was 40 years old.
Having an open book on research, anything he wanted to do, he of course wanted to research these substances.
When I went to Harvard, there was another young professor who was a very lovable, charismatic person, and we joined up as a team. Richard Alpert, who's now Ramdas, has been more conservative.
When I was at Harvard with Timothy, I was so gung-ho. I had appointments in 4 departments simultaneously, and also research contracts at Stanford.
Fantastically successful. I mean, he had appointments at Stanford and at Harvard, and then he had a plane, and he had a car, and he had, you know, he was like a shining star. He had tremendous charisma.
I was an undergraduate at Harvard between 1960 and 1964. I had met Dick Alpert at a party. I found him uncomfortable to be around. He seemed to me not comfortable in his own being.
I was like Mr. Power Player in academia. Timothy was way outside of that. Of all the colleagues around me, he frightened me because he was so free. He was the only consciousness on the faculty that hadn't been co-opted by Harvard, that wasn't impressed with being at Harvard.
I saw you were laughing at the system, you know, and I had no sense of humor whatsoever.
You're not supposed to laugh at Harvard and
I know. There was nobody else at Harvard laughing at it but you.
I began to sense what a visionary was, that Timothy had the ability to see outside of systems, and therefore he could open things to where you'd go, but it would take you a while to get there, maybe. And he was doing that for me.
I didn't do that.
You did.
It was a drug.
You freed me, but you gave me the drug. You enticed, not enticed me, you told me what the possibility was, and I trusted you.
In the fall of 1960, Leary discovered that Sandoz Limited, a pharmaceutical company, would send synthesized psilocybin to qualified researchers. He had access to the active ingredient of magic mushrooms. Leary then set up a research program to investigate the effects of psilocybin. Staff members trained as guides and took the drug alongside volunteer subjects in specially prepared supportive settings. This approach became known as set and setting. Careful evaluations were made of each session. Alpert was away at UC Berkeley, but that winter he took psilocybin for the first time at Leary's house in Newton Center. It stripped him of the various identities he had built up in himself over 30 years. He wrote, "I realized that although everything by which I knew myself, even my body and this life itself, was gone, still I was fully aware."
As professor went, and middle-class boy went, and pilot went, and all of my games were like going off into the distance, I got this terrible panic because indeed I was going to cease to exist. And I got the panic, which is the panic that precedes the psychological death, because indeed Richard Alpert was dying at that point. And the panic was, no, stop, I've got to hold on to something so I'll know who I am. And Timothy, the wise old Timothy, always says things like, trust your nervous system.
And you, at dawn, went home.
Yes.
And you were shoveling
the
snow in front of your mother and father's house, and your mother
Yes.
said, "What are you doing out there?"
You idiot, come in, it's 4 in the morning, nobody shovels snow.
She said, "I love you, Mom," or something.
And
like
I
that.
said, I love you, and I went back to shoveling snow. You
Yeah.
freed me at that moment
Yes.
from my mother.
Yeah.
That's what you did.
The psilocybin project was widely supported and above reproach. The drug was legally obtained from Sandoz, the project authorized by Harvard.
I heard about these 2 professors at Harvard who were offering to give people psilocybin in return for having them write about their experiences. I arranged to have a session with Richard. I felt very comfortable with him, you know, so I thought this could only be a positive experience. And it really confirmed a lot of things that I had hoped were true, that I had sort of glimpsed at various times in my life. So in other words, that there was a kind of a larger reality than what my everyday humdrum experiences were.
I read about mescaline, I think after I graduated from high school, and was fascinated by it, you know, read everything I could on it, wanted to try it. When I got to Harvard, Aldous Huxley had come to MIT to give a series of lectures on visionary experience. I found out that Leary and Alpert were teaching at Harvard and were interested in this, so I went over and made an appointment. I met Leary. I had a good conversation with him. He told me that, you know, that he thought these drugs were the most interesting things he'd ever found, and the potential was enormous. He didn't see any downside to them. I asked him if I could be a subject in his research, and he told me that they'd made an agreement with the university that they couldn't use undergraduates. So I got a supply of mescaline, independent of anything to do with them. I took it a number of times with a group of friends of mine who were undergraduates. Had variable experiences with it. One quite powerful, but I didn't know what to do with that. You know, it seems to me if I followed the implications of that, I would drop out of college, and I didn't want to do that. So I think I boxed all that up and set it aside.
Branching out, the professors organized a prisoner rehabilitation project. Psilocybin was given to selected inmates at Concord State Prison. Their hope was to help them break through the habits that kept getting them rearrested. Another famous study had 30 seminary students taking psilocybin at Boston University Chapel during one of the year's main services. It became known as the Good Friday experiment.
There were 16 of us in this small chapel who had ingested. I very soon felt the awe coming over me.
It's probably the greatest Good Friday in 2,000 years.
In the spring of 1962, just as the psilocybin project was becoming almost manageable, a British researcher arrived from England with a more powerful psychoactive drug, LSD. Lysergic acid diethylamide was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann from a derivative of ryegrass fungus at the Swiss headquarters of Sandoz in 1938. 5 years later, he accidentally got some on his skin and discovered its mind-bending properties during an epic bike ride home. Hoffman not only survived the ride, but continued as a chemist at Sandoz for many years. He lived to be 102. At first, Leary resisted the idea of including LSD in the Harvard project. Researching psilocybin was pushing administrators far enough. Another issue was the reputation LSD had of being a mind-controlled drug, researched by the military. But his own experience convinced Leary that LSD held potential for scientific discovery far beyond that of psilocybin.
The LSD was interesting because when he took the LSD, he didn't talk for about 5 days. And I got afraid we'd lost Timothy.
It's hard to describe what it was like taking LSD under the setting of the early 60s. The rending away from all of these very intense paradigms of authority and monotheism and culture.
As a good lieutenant on the ship, I sort of battened down the hatches and told everybody not to touch the stuff and not to, just to, wait. And then Timothy, finally, when he was able to speak, it was more like, wow, or, whew, or yes, and then we all started.
Leary and Albert saw their research as connected to the centuries-long use of psychotropic plants by indigenous people throughout the world. Psychedelic, from the Greek words psyche and delos, literally means mind manifesting. After their sessions, subjects reported many common perceptions. Barriers dissolved. Everything seemed alive, even inanimate objects. They felt a oneness with everything. Colors in solid patterns were transfixing, mesmerizing. The experience seemed to come in waves.
The psychotropic drugs, which are not really recognized as existing or valid tools, were demonized and glorified for the wrong reasons in the 60s. That's natural. The thing is, know what you're doing.
It is normal and natural to seek altered states of consciousness, high states. We do it all the time in various ways. Drugs are one way of getting into them. Well, there's two classes of psychedelics. One are the ones that are mescaline and its relatives, more stimulants than the other ones. The other ones called the indoles, which is LSD and psilocybin and DMT, really are remarkably light in their effects on the physical body. I think as a group, these drugs are very non-toxic. The main dangers are psychological ones of people becoming panicked, terrified. But I think the positive potentials are terrific.
LSD is not a drug like alcohol or barbiturate. LSD is a chemical which contains several hundred Encyclopedia Britannicas. So when you talk to someone who's taken LSD, or if you have a sitting who's taken LSD, his consciousness is being spun through many, many different levels of language, which are not the language of English or French or Latin, but chemical languages of cell and nervous system, sense organ, which are many millions of years old. What's the reaction to taking LSD? If the person is unprepared and he swallows this local library of chemical messages, he's confused. He can be entranced and delighted, or he can be very frightened.
The experiences personally that I had with psychedelics was all about opening my mind, and it was always for me about the spiritual journey. It affected a whole generation of people that way. It ended the 1950s. It was as though the splitting of the atom was going to be followed by another kind of splitting, but it was the breaking open of the heart and the opening of the mind.
You know, the reason that I took LSD, and I think many of us did, is a hunger to be an explorer.
I think they made me aware of the magic in the world, of seeing things not just from the scientific perspective. They really connected me with nature in a way that I wasn't before. They really showed me the potential of how changing things in here changes things out there, and that's been a major theme of my work.
It's important to understand that certain drugs really are sacred substances. If you are going to use some of the sacred drugs, to use them in the right context with the right people. Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert recognized this.
I think the early work that they did with psychedelics was very important. They showed that set and setting really influenced the experience greatly, that the mindset of the experimenters greatly influenced the outcomes. And they really demonstrated positive potentials of the use of psychedelics, which I think just now, is becoming a focus of attention again.
Doctors Joan Halifax and Stan Groff were among the first to research the use of psychedelics with the dying. In their case, terminal cancer patients in 1967.
In the dying process, there's often a lot of fear. And I think psychedelics make it possible to step aside from that and observe what's happening dispassionately. A guided psychedelic experience in a dying person often enabled that person to drastically cut doses of opiates for pain relief, which kept consciousness clear. It often greatly facilitated communication with family and friends, where before there was no honest communication of what was going on. And it made the dying process easier. And this was strongly positive results of these studies. So I think surrounding the use of drugs with ritual, making the occasions of taking them special, paying great attention to set and setting, is all part of minimizing their potential for harm.
We used to use the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a manual for psychedelic trips. And that really is a manual of leaving your body and going into what they call a bardo state. And, it's like a manual for death, really.
Well, the drug literature, going back to William James and the Harvard people 100 years ago, they always said it's a dying experience, or it's a death experience. There's a classic mystic thing of joy and wonder, but I'm not advocating, boys and girls. It's like anything else that's complicated. I'm very cautious. I've taken almost every drug there is, but the reason I can survive as well as I do is I'm prudent and I'm careful, and I try to find out what's involved. 20 years ago, we knew almost nothing about the brain. Now we know 120 billion neurons. Every neuron in your brain has 10,000 connections. It's going to take us decades to begin to understand the magnificence, the complexity of this brain, which creates the realities we inhabit.
According to Leary, we use but a small percentage of our nervous system's capacity, that we've learned over thousands of years to restrict the use of our brains so we can function in society. Psychedelics open the full landscape of our minds.
It was as if all these did was accentuate the direction his life was always going in, freeing himself from systems, freeing himself from all of the ways that our mind creates our reality.
Mythic heroes travel unknown oceans in search of adventure and new lands. American astronauts were about to launch themselves into outer space. In the 1960s, Leary and Alpert dedicated themselves to exploring the nature of inner space.
That's the word Timothy and I always use. That's the mythic level that Timothy and I lived at, was we were adventurers.
They averaged 1 LSD session per week and took heroic doses. They saw themselves as psychedelic adventurers, exploring the nature of reality, encountering both heaven and hell. They openly shared the results of their work, encouraging others to join them. LSD was at that time still fully legal. It was an innocent time and a wild ride.
Driving up to Sandoz in New Jersey in the huge black railroad limousine that I had from my father's railroad with railroad wheels on the end of it. And Timothy and I are driving up to buy this huge amount of LSD as Harvard professors. And you know, there were so many of those, just one after another after another.
Ever the scientists, Leary and Alpert published articles in journals and delivered papers at conferences. The word was out, and their program was becoming popular, maybe too popular.
It ended up so many graduate students wanted to work with Leary, and almost all the other graduate professors lost students' assistants, you see, which pissed them off, of course.
Independently, about that same time, I had joined the editorial board of the Harvard Crimson, the newspaper. And there were stories beginning to go around about the drug experiments at Harvard and Leary and Alpert. And I was really the only person that had knowledge of that. So it was logical that I became the reporter who dealt with that.
Psilocybin was to be given only to graduate students. But there was one slip.
That guy that I turned on, one person, was somebody to whom I was attracted.
I was in a very difficult role in that. For one thing, I had taken these drugs. I had positive feelings for them, but I had a kind of dual life. You know, I was this straight undergraduate who was doing this investigative reporting.
I think he wrote an article in the Harvard Crimson talking about this, and parents of this one boy found out about it, and they went to the officials at Harvard and said, "What's going on here?"
The dean of Harvard said, if he didn't squeal on me, they're not going to give him the diploma.
I played a key role in getting information which eventually led to Alpert's being fired in 1963. Leary was never fired. He quit voluntarily. That story was front page news in the New York Times. And I think that was probably the first time that most Americans had ever heard of psychedelic drugs or LSD or mushrooms. So I do think that that whole episode is what exploded this out of Harvard into the nation and the culture.
Of course, this was a bit of a shock, to put it mildly, to Richard, who had been the one who was on the tenure track, and he had his career all sort of mapped out, he thought.
You were on the tenure track.
I know I was. And you
If it weren't
laughed.
for me,
and you laughed.
If it weren't for me, you would be a...
I'd be somebody today.
Retired Harvard.
You blew my cup. You blew me apart. I would have been somebody today.
Yeah, I ruined your academic career.
You did. You absolutely did. What happened was you were the one that showed me that it was possible to escape from the system. You know, you really did. I mean, it's been hard for me to really understand how I was ready to hear that, even, you know?
Timothy's contract at Harvard ended soon after Dick was fired in the spring of '63. They desperately wanted to continue their work, which was becoming highly controversial, but still legal. Where could they go?
Just by chance, my brothers inherited quite a bit of money, and they had decided to, with this money as a good investment, to buy this huge property in Millbrook, New York. On the property was an old house there that was the original house that had belonged to the person who developed the property back in the late 19th, early 20th century. Kind of wanted it to be haunted, you know. It was huge and lots of turrets and curved glass. It was really beautiful. And so I talked to my brothers. They weren't going to use it. And they said, sure, we'll rent you the house for $1 a year.
With Tim's children, Susan and Jack, and a potpourri of friends and acquaintances, the two men launched into a life of communal living. That fall, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The decade had taken a very nasty turn. At Millbrook, the scientists continued their research into 1964, adapting the old house to its hipper inhabitants. It soon became a second home to artists and academics, musicians and scientists. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, the 60s were heating up. The free speech movement in Berkeley began a reinvigoration of democracy that would lead to the Summer of Love in 1967. LSD, acid, was often shared freely. Years later, it became known that the CIA ran secret experiments with LSD in the 1950s and 60s, hoping to find a way to use the drug in warfare. Inevitably, some of their subjects began using the chemicals on their own. Ken Kesey had first taken LSD as part of a CIA-funded research project while working in a mental hospital. Later, he and the Merry Pranksters held acid tests, giving LSD to hundreds, much to the dismay of the scientists at Millbrook.
I have never urged indiscriminate use of LSD, and I've never propagandized for LSD. Strangely enough, my position on LSD is exactly that of the President Johnson administration. I believe that the present laws which penalize sale and manufacture of LSD are right.
Meanwhile, I did been hearing out on the West Coast that they were filling up bathtubs full of LSD and feeding it to anybody that wanted to come in and drink, you know, as much as they wanted, and playing crazy music for them. And I thought this was fucking drug abuse.
The use of psychedelic drugs such as marijuana, mescaline, LSD is out of control in the United States today.
Over 4 years of communal living at Millbrook and scores of shared psilocybin and LSD sessions, Leary and Alpert developed a close and trusting relationship. Richard took on a domestic motherly role, becoming closer to Timothy's children than Tim was himself.
And I got into the really conscious thing in my mind that I could justify my life being a support system for Timothy's vision to find expression. So it meant raising money, it meant raising children, it meant cooking, it meant getting housing, it meant moving jeeps and stuff to islands we were being thrown off of, you know. I mean, it was incredible. It meant setting up foundations. It meant, it was all the public relations stuff to try to keep the game from getting out of hand.
Richard, you know how to operate this?
In December 1964, Leary married again.
The two studs. This comes in the front, so this goes in the back. It goes like that. You need a stud.
Gunther, you got the studs? Yeah, they're over there.
Peggy Hitchcock had introduced him to the beautiful fashion model Nina, and they fell in love.
Remember as much of the vows as you can. Yes, and I will.
They were married at a chapel in the nearby town. Dick was best man. Timothy and Nena set off on a world tour, visiting Japan and India in a quest for spiritual understanding. But by the time they returned to Millbrook, the marriage was over. Leary would eventually marry 5 times. His best efforts never went into sustaining relationships.
In his life, there was a big disconnect between his heart and his mind. And his mind was completely in charge always, and the heart kind of got left behind.
Intimacy. They wanted psychological intimacy. He was offering a different kind of intimacy, which is the kind of intimacy he and I had, which is the intimacy of shared awareness, like, you know, and that kind of thing. He didn't get as deep into psychodynamic stuff. I mean, here he was, a psychologist who had created a very, very highly regarded diagnostic psychological inventory for assessing personality. The reason he was so good at that is because he was outside of that. That domain, or that plane of consciousness, didn't engage him, so that most of the women around him were always disappointed.
Now you do the tie, and then you fold that thing over.
Tim's friendship with Dick also grew rocky. Theirs had been like a marriage, at least in some ways.
My capacity to be in that relationship to Timothy, part of it, I'm sure, arises from the fact that I'm basically gay. And my relation with Timothy was never physical love. But there was a love affair going on. I mean, we loved each other. We really loved each other. And I became very trustworthy for Tim to push against, you know, to lean on in a way to get further out. And Timothy was taking me out with him. Going out with him wasn't all fun and games. I mean, it was extremely scary because I had grown up in a family that treasured antiques, for example. So that my apartment in Cambridge, when I was a Harvard professor, was full of absolutely beautiful antiques, highboys. And then I moved to Millbrook, where it was monkeys and aardvarks and cats and 6 dogs and many children. And I mean, we were in a 63-room house, you know? And I watched my antiques one by, I didn't have the intelligence to just sell them. You know, I watched them all just be destroyed before my eyes. It was undercutting something very deep in me. Then, as the years went on, something very profound happened, because I started to distinguish between visionary and revolutionary. And that Timothy was both, and I loved the visionary part. And what I saw was that the revolutionary part of it was costing so much, psychically and financially and socially and everything. We were $50,000 in debt, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pay it off. And we were getting further and further out all the time as we got thrown out of more and more countries. I thought, as much fun as it was, now it was no longer so much fun. And the other part of it was, being in a relationship with somebody that way, ultimately, that other part of you never develops. And I realized that I was a more creative person than this situation was allowing me to be. And at that point, I think that's when we started to pull apart.
In the fall of 1965, Richard Alpert left Millbrook for good. The awakenings that psychedelics provided him never lasted long. Alpert and others hungered for a way to maintain and integrate expanded states of consciousness.
You know, eventually the world of mind-manifesting substances became more like decoration. In this era of the civil rights and the anti-war movement, I realized that to be engaged politically, I had to also be engaged with my own mind. And I just wanted to really train my mind to be very, very stable and to be able to perceive my own mental continuum clearly and not have it so decorated.
As Alpert was leaving, Leary began a new relationship with Rosemary Woodruff. They closed up the house at Millbrook and began a trip to Mexico with Tim's children, Susan and Jack. But at the border crossing in Laredo, Texas, they were arrested for the possession of less than half an ounce of marijuana, for which Leary received a jail sentence of 30 years. They returned to Millbrook and began fighting the conviction. Ultimately, the Supreme Court overturned the sentence, but Nixon was not satisfied with that outcome. Leary was indeed later jailed, but for interstate transportation, not possession.
You're not going to solve these problems by putting leading scientists like myself in jail for 30 or 40-year prison terms for doing nothing more than attempting to use and understand these new forms of energy for which yet there's no evidence that we've done any damage to society or to ourselves or to other people.
In 1966, drug use of all kinds was on the rise in America. Even though his views were controversial, Leary was invited to testify before Congress.
We have been told today, and we read in the papers, reports from sociologists, that from between 15 to 50%, in some cases up to 65 and 70% of our college students are experimenting with these mind-opening chemicals. And I recommend respectfully to this committee that you consider legislation which will license responsible adults to use these drugs for serious purposes such as spiritual growth, the pursuit of knowledge, or in their own personal development. To obtain such a license, the applicant, I think, should have to meet physical, intellectual, and emotional criteria.
Your testimony, I understand extremely clearly, and it's becoming more clear now, that you feel that there shouldn't be an indiscriminate possession is something that you do not support.
For 6 years, sir, I have been against indiscriminate use.
Indiscriminate use, all right.
And he felt very strongly that he would be able to convince Congress that psychotropic drugs be given over to the medical profession for healing purposes.
Police officer, open the door.
And he knew that the minute they decided to make this a law enforcement issue, it would be everywhere. There would be no stopping it. Everybody would be able to get hold of it. That was terrible for him. That's where he developed a very strong rebel side towards the government.
As Leary continued fighting the government and the Texas courts, the direction of Richard Alpert's life changed forever. He had left the country in 1967 on a trip through Asia. One day in Nepal, he met a young Westerner who had adopted the ways of the Indian ascetics, known as sadhus. Bhagwan Das seemed to embody what Richard was looking for. So he abandoned his first-class junket, and together they descended barefoot into India. Before long, Richard was introduced to the Indian saint who would become his guru, Neem Karoli Baba, known to his followers as Maharaji. Maharaji gave Richard his spiritual name, Ram Das, which means servant of God.
My guru is about a 70-year-old man. I don't know anything about him, really. You know, I don't even know that he exists, to tell you the truth. But it seemed to me that there was a little old man in a blanket, and when I looked at him, the first time I looked at him, I thought I wasn't going to be hustled. And the second time I looked at him, all I wanted to do was touch his feet.
I looked up, and he was looking at me with unconditional love. And I had never been looked at with unconditional love by anybody. I felt loved. I felt loved. And I felt something happening in my heart.
Ram Dass studied yoga and meditation before returning to America, a changed man.
Timothy trained me in the beginning of my escape, and Maharaji then took over, really. I see them as my two powerful teachers in escape.
And he comes back and, you know, he's maybe 80 pounds lighter and is putting on a lot of holy man airs that are particularly grating, having seen him in his previous manifestation. You know, and I'm thinking, you know, same guy, new shtick.
Encouraged by Maharaji, Ram Dass explored his Indian awakenings in the book Be Here Now, which became a manual for spiritual seekers throughout the world. It was first published in 1971, hand-stamped and inked at the Lama Foundation in New Mexico. Originally a limited edition with hand-stitched pages, it is now in its 43rd printing.
Be Here Now was seminal. It's still seminal. It's still opening up young people's minds. They get that book and it does what it did to us so long ago. It's amazing. Ram Dass was a bridge between East and West and was a major person to open this gateway to Eastern wisdom, to Western culture.
You can tell me where the Be Here Now come from. That was you.
Be Here Now?
Yeah. You've heard of that, haven't you?
Yeah. Well,
you invented that.
Yeah. But it was really actually Bhagwan Das, who every time my mind would go off into my Jewish neuroticism, he'd say, look, just come back here and be here now. So I took it as a title, but he used to say it to me.
Since then, Ram Dass has traveled and taught widely, written numerous books, and putting spirit into action, co-founded service organizations.
I'm going to run for the governorship of the state of California.
In 1968, Leary was again busted for pot, this time by the California State Police during his abortive run for governor against the incumbent, Ronald Reagan. He had the support of people like John Lennon, who wrote the Beatles' tune Come Together for the campaign. Named the most dangerous man in America by President Richard Nixon, Leary insisted the marijuana found in his car had been planted.
One evening I was in a parked car and a policeman came up to the car and opened the door against my wishes, made a pass at the ashtray and said, "You're under arrest for," I said, "For what?" He said, "For marijuana." "What marijuana?" He reached in his pocket, he pulled out 2 joints that I'd never seen before, half joints, and said, "You're under arrest."
He was finally jailed in 1970, one of the first casualties of the war on drugs. But when he was given the very personality assessment he had himself devised at Berkeley in the 1950s, he got himself assigned to a minimum security prison. Then he escaped, with the aid of the Weather Underground and the Black Panthers.
Comment on your plans now. My plans are to work with the Black Panther Party for the overthrow of the American government.
When we crossed paths in Algeria, he didn't look like he was having that much fun. Aldrich Cleaver looked definitely distressed, and it didn't look like they were enjoying each other. But I think Tim played with every edge.
He spoke about his life in terms of being imprisoned and escaping. So he said that he was in prison and he escaped and he went to Algeria with his wife Rosemary, and once again he was imprisoned and he needed to escape. And then he went to Switzerland, and once again, instead of being imprisoned by Aldrich Cleaver and his politics, then he was imprisoned by a gangster and his machinations. Rosemary left him while they were in Switzerland. I think he was very sad about that, and I think he absolutely adored her. You know who Timothy Leary was for me in the beginning? He was just a song of the Moody Blues. Timothy Leary's dead. Little by little, I sort of got this romantic image that this Timothy Leary might be, you know, like the king of outlaws. Through a series of extraordinary coincidences, I met Timothy Leary in Switzerland and found out that he was a fugitive from prison. I was 26 years old, and I found that very exciting. It felt like it was my destiny to meet him, and I was ready for anything with him. We flew to Afghanistan from Vienna. When we got to the airport in Afghanistan, an attaché of the American embassy stole our passports out of Timothy's hands, and this incredible ordeal started. I was taken with him back to California, where I'd never been. It was a perfect PR coup for Nixon. 2 days before the inauguration, we got brought back in front of hundreds of journalists. So Nixon had the front page. Timothy Leary brought into custody. He was in Folsom Prison for a year.
For those of you who know him, he's relaxed and he looks well. But behind the camera sits the warden, the assistant warden, and probably the captain of the guard. I am Joanna Leary, and I'd like to see him out of here as quick as possible.
What do you think of your future? Do you think you're going to walk out of Folsom Prison a free man one day?
I think my future is very intimately connected with the future of this country. You just can't keep your philosophers in prison. If I am kept in prison, it's going to be a very bad symptom for freedom and for hope and for union.
I began to see this man come out of his solitary confinement cell, somewhat confused, very red eyes. He told me that they probably fed him drugs in the food they were giving him. They let me visit him when he was in a padded cell. He was in a straitjacket. His head was shaved, and he began to change in the sense that there was less and less and less of Timothy Leary on the outside. Isolation is not only to keep somebody in a box, but it's so they unlearn to communicate with the outside world.
Criminalizing use, possession of drugs doesn't work, and it makes everything worse. I don't think we can suddenly legalize things overnight. I believe in education as the key to rational drug policy, and that means being honest about their positive effects as well as negative effects, being honest about the drugs whose use we not only tolerate but promote, like alcohol and tobacco, and that we make money from, our government makes money from. So, you know, it's real education, truthful education, and I think it has to be at all levels of society.
Timothy decided to turn state and federal evidence so he would get out of prison. The next morning, the feds came and said, "We've received news that people want to kill you, both of you, and so you have to go into the witness protection program." Timothy insisted that they bring us to Santa Fe. Our names were changed to James and Nora Joyce. We were two drunks lost in the wilderness, trying to encounter each other. The loneliness, the separation, the isolation had driven my alcoholism and my drug addiction to an excruciating place. And so we fought a lot. We had both suffered so much. And from where I look at it right now, I think that the right move for him was to blame me.
In the end, Leary spent almost 4 years in jail, of which 2.5 were in solitary confinement. But no matter how dark the circumstances, he always remembered that Marshal McLuhan had advised him to wave reassuringly, radiate courage, and you must be known for your smile.
I've been in 40 jails and 4 continents.
I haven't even been busted yet.
The proliferation of LSD and psychedelics and marijuana even within popular culture, it was a Pandora's box. You know, the second youth culture got a hold of it, it exploded, you know, much greater than anybody knew it would, much greater than he knew it would.
Tim really was naive, innocent. He did not anticipate the kind of reaction.
Nevertheless, Leary is often solely blamed for their popularization and misuse.
As that poisonous, evil man, Dr. Timothy Leary, has said, it is a way to turn on, tune in, and drop out.
People say, you ruined an entire generation. Like, That's 72 million people. I said, yeah. They said, don't you feel regret? And I said, well, one thing I feel is only 100,000 of them have the decency to thank me for ruining their lives.
Turn on to the internal neurological energy. Tune in means to harness up the new revelation and energy in your life. And drop out. Now, this may sound reckless advice today, but it's the oldest advice that philosophers and religious leaders have passed on. Detach, drop out, find what's within. Turn on, tune in, and drop out. And I stand by that statement.
Over time, Leary was dismissive of Dick Alpert's spiritual journey, which he saw as merely playing lieutenant to yet another prophetic master.
Leary did not like gurus, period.
Timothy seemed quite comfortable with the metaphors of the religious traditions. But later, those became grist for the mill of his revolution also. And he treated me like sort of an old-fashioned type person.
Once Leary's long struggle with the FBI and the Justice Department was concluded, he settled in Los Angeles with his fifth wife, Barbara Chase, and her son Zachary.
Timothy Leary married my mother when I was 4 years old, and he was the father who raised me for from ages 4 until 22, until he died when I was 22 years old. So I lived with him for 17 years, and I think somebody pointed out to me once that I have the great distinction of living with him longer than anybody else did, ever. You know, so he was just, a great, very kind of standard white picket fence father with me. And most people don't know that, and when I tell people that, it's really a surprise. I mean, you know, he took me to Little League practice. He played baseball with me in the yard. We went to Dodger games all the time. He made sure I did my homework. I mean, it was, you know, shockingly normal.
After some years of estrangement, Leary and Ram Dass's love for each other as mythic explorers guided their reconnection.
The last 20 years have been remarkable. They have put us through the changes, and we've put them through some changes.
He didn't ask me for legitimacy of his life, and I didn't ask him for legitimacy of mine. That allowed a new kind of respect to emerge between us, which was interesting. It was a respect that honored our differences rather than the adventure of sharing an idea. And I really felt that Timothy really respected me at the end, and I certainly respected him.
The question of, am I afraid to die, is something I actually live with every day.
I think everybody's afraid to die. The question is, how do you deal with the fear?
I like being alive. I like this incarnation, you know, I'm attached to it.
If I weren't afraid to die, I would not be taking it seriously. I mean, in some ways, I think death is the most important experience that you're preparing for all your life.
Why is it so important to talk about death? It's the unspoken phobia of the culture. You can see it if you look at the major issues like abortion, death penalty, euthanasia, terrorism. It all concerns this issue of death.
When I discovered I was dying, and I knew I was going to die actively and creatively, I called Ram Dass because I knew he would understand.
Like this.
See that? That's a gallery of some book I wrote years ago. He's a wise friend and a loving, protective friend over many years and many experiences.
Tim and I, in 1963 with Ralph, were doing the psychedelic experience, which was a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And that led to a pretty deep study of psychedelics, and since we were both dealing with what we considered was psychological death and rebirth, and we had been through those death-rebirth experiences many times together, it's reasonable for him to think of me as somebody who would understand what this death experience was going to be like for him.
The psychedelic experience was the first modern book to provide a map for mind-expanding drug sessions, much as the Tibetan Book of the Dead provided advice for traveling through after-death states known to Tibetan Buddhists as bardos.
Bardo actually means in between. This is a bardo too. We are in the bardo of life. They were talking about the bardo connected to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the bardo between death and rebirth. And they identified LSD as a vehicle to pre-experience what that would be like.
Long before I knew I was dying, we were using this metaphor of leaving your body, leaving your mind, and contacting a different level of altered states, expanded consciousness. So my life has prepared me for this.
I've seen so many people die clinging to the past and also worried about the future. I think this is the moment. That's what I got, is this moment. And one of these moments, I'll be dead. And that'll be the moment.
In 1977, Ram Dass founded the Dying Project with Stephen and Andre Levine and Dale Borglum. He's been a kind of midwife to the dying since 1963, offering wisdom, compassion, and his knowledge of other planes of consciousness.
Ram Dass was the pioneer. He's the person who really opened up that field for me personally.
The amount of cost in keeping people alive, forget quality of life now, just physically alive, the intensive care unit strategy was finally prohibitive. It was getting prohibitive. It was just eating up all the resources. Then comes the hospice movement, which says, oh, well, what we've missed is that the psychological part of dying is also important. And hospice is much cheaper than intensive care unit. Well, all it requires is that we accept the fact that death exists. And that's a big shift, to accept death existing versus it's a failure and an enemy.
What Ram Dass did was really inspire people to bring spirituality and existential questions into their awareness so that they could not only die well, but also live well.
I do a lot of grief work with people. And what I often am finding myself saying to people who have lost their child or their spouse after many years or something, you will grieve and grieve and grieve, and it'll come up for air and think it's all over and I'll be strong, and then you'll go back under and you'll go through depressions, and let it all run its course. Don't push it. Your mind will recite all the ways you've lost the person, that you'll never have the smell of their body, you'll, you know, all these things. Milk it all, don't push it away. But there will come a time when your mind will quiet down a little bit. And in the quietness of that moment, the love that you've ever tasted with that person will be living and present. And then you'll realize that what the essence was that made you connect with this person has nothing to do with death. That love transcends death, basically. But you're going to have to find it out for yourself. But it's true.
I had this tragic loss. The great love of my life dropped dead on me. I was getting this huge overflowing of love from other people, and it was absolutely useless. I mean, I felt like a black hole for love. I mean, it didn't make any difference what anybody said. They didn't understand what it felt like. And I felt like they were wasting their love on me, which is a terrible feeling. And I mentioned this to Ram Dass. And he said, I said, I feel like a bottomless well of, you know, I mean, it just love goes in and you never hear anything hit bottom. And he said, well, consider the possibility that it's not bottomless, that it's very deep. sorry. And that one day it will fill with love. I don't know, that still kind of gets me.
Death and someone dying is an initiation that we as human beings go through. And it enriches us, it deepens us, it opens our hearts. It's a terrible thing, but I think it makes us bigger and deeper and more compassionate as people.
I found out I had cancer about a year ago, but the real pressure of it, the symptomatic pressure of it, just the last 2 or 3 months. I've had moments of deep pain. I've had moments when the pain pills would almost knock me out. And I was sort of worried to my friends because I was suffering so much. And it's been a shock to me to discover that pain exists and it can really dominate your consciousness. So I've had to work that through.
There we go. See, the issue is pain and consciousness, the relation of pain to consciousness. Because when you're looking at it from just the physical body, the goal is to get rid of as much pain as possible, even if you have to put the person to sleep, keep them asleep till they die. That's the most humane thing to do.
Here we are, 6 years later, and I've had a stroke 5 years ago. I don't remember time, but this is now 03.
In February 1997, Ram Dass suffered a severe stroke and a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Doctors gave him only a 10% chance of survival. Hundreds of hours of rehabilitation later, he was still partially paralyzed, though able to get around in a wheelchair. After years of service, he had to learn to accept the help of others.
I am more now identified with my soul and more compassionate to my body.
I don't know how I'll be if I'm in your situation. At this moment, I don't feel anxious at all. I mean, about my life or anything. Anything.
The stroke was so painful that I pushed it away by going to the witness in the soul, just witnessing the stroke rather than experiencing the stroke. What a psychologist would label dissociation. Sure. Yeah.
My pains I treat lovingly. Pain, a worthy adversary. We're going to have to fight it out.
He has been through a lot. It's interesting to be with him because there's an absence of self-pity there. And the fact he's been in that chair for 15 years, I mean, that is no joke. And he's over 80 now. And I mean, that's really remarkable that he's lived so long. It's a testimony to his delightful determination that I think is a kind of model for all of us. There's something about his essence which has not changed at all. I really feel it's love.
Ram Dass now lives in Hawaii, cared for by a community of loving friends and students. He's more active than ever, teaching, writing, counseling, and appearing virtually.
My body is 80 years old. I am a soul.
Although still physically restricted, he continues his work, furthering the vision he pioneered with Timothy Leary more than 40 years ago. Adding to his personal legacy is a son, Peter Reichert. Ram Dass was introduced to him in 2009. It was a shock to both of them.
Wow, in a million years. of all the crazy things. And what a great guy, Peter, his son.
Peter had never heard of Ram Dass, let alone that he was his biological father. Long ago, Richard Alpert had a brief affair with Peter's mother while teaching at Stanford, before his Harvard years with Timothy Leary. Peter was the result, but his mother had moved back east and never told Richard. Now, more than 50 years later, Ram Dass finds himself connected to a new and growing family in the final years of his current incarnation.
The amazing thing, the great singular accomplishment of Ram Dass's life, I think, is that setting out from, not very promising beginnings, he has become a truly wise person. Deeply.
If you see that the moment of death is the moment when you engage the deepest mystery of the universe, and that's what the whole Eastern traditions are about, preparing you for that moment so that you will be equanimous, you will be curious, you'll be present, you'll be non-clinging to the past and not grabbing, just be with each moment, moment by moment. Some people do some of their most profound spiritual work in the last few minutes before they die.
Wanting to get a head start, why leave it till the last minute? Timothy Leary, at 75, approached his final days with characteristic enthusiasm. He promised to give death a better name or die trying.
We're all going to die. Why not learn how to do it with class and style and friendship as the climactic expression of a life? The last week, I have not been using any pills, and it's been a fascinating, wonderful experience so far. I've become very friendly with my cancer, and I say in public, my cancer I see now as my teacher, and I try to talk to her, and I say, Miss Cancer, let's say we're in it together, and we're both stuck. We're both stuck in the same body, see?
Yes, exactly.
So let's make a deal. Hey, let's keep the body alive a while, and we can have more fun. When the heart waves flatline, the brain goes on. They call it the sliver of opportunity. Your life flashed in front of you.
And you go into ecstasy.
The light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah, that's all comes from near-death experiences. The brain is happy, because then the brain is in the states that the Buddhists talk about. It's pure consciousness.
Sure, it's extricated itself from all the senses.
Yeah, but see, that 15 minutes is timeless, like an LSD session. You go through 95 lifetimes and death.
Well, every minute is timeless.
There you go, yeah. Like everybody else, I'm speculating, and I may change. I'm trying to learn.
This period that Timothy Leary speaks about, this 15 to 20-minute period, what that would be called in the Tibetan teaching is still the process of dying. So you're not dead yet, but the gross body is dead, but the subtle body is still remaining in the body. So that's what he's identifying.
At this period in human history, we're lucky enough to be here when, for the first time, scientists are developing ways to keep you alive or to bring you back. The churches say, no, you have no right to take, your body belongs to God. Well, show me the paperwork.
By 1993, Timothy and Barbara had divorced, although Tim remained close to her son, Zach.
He had a lot of personal heartache in his life. His wife, Marianne, killed herself, and every marriage ended in divorce. His daughter, Susan, also committed suicide. Jack didn't speak to him. So there was a lot of heavy stuff going on there, a lot of heavy karmas, and a lot of interpersonal relationships that he just really couldn't work out. And I think, that it really broke his heart. And there's no question that, him getting to raise me again was a chance for him to do it over again. He had an uncanny knack to reinvent himself, especially in the late 80s and into the 90s. He was much more of a cyberculture icon than he was, a 60s hippie icon. And that's why he kept young people around, because he was so fascinated with youth culture and with computer culture and, early internet culture and cyberpunk culture and music culture and art.
Every technique that science has now for bringing you back, I've signed up with. I'm going to have my blood cells available for cloning.
It's inconceivable to me that Timothy could have taken as much acid as he's taken and been through as much as he's been through and end up a philosophical materialist in which when the body's dead, you're dead. Yet that's what he professed.
Why did it end up that you're interested in things here and now, and I'm interested in La La Land all the time? Why is that?
You're not really.
I am. I am.
What do you mean? What's La La Land?
Well,
You
I'm
make it
interested
sound
in the
good.
awareness that happens after the brain gets eaten. When I think about the moment of death, I usually think of a great acid trip. I think of the dissolution of conceptual structures.
I have, under my personal supervision, witnessed over 3,000 ingestions of LSD.
Over 3,000. Well, can you briefly describe the effect of it?
No, sir. You might say, I was sitting there and suddenly I began to dissolve. Every cell in my body began to break down. And I was afraid I'd become a puddle on the floor. Then I saw a huge serpent coming up. The serpent swallowed me. I went into the serpent's stomach. Later I was excreted and I exploded.
You see Teddy Kennedy there. You just, it's like, oh my gosh, these guys must have been having their own little mental breakdown listening to him.
Now, by this time, even the most experienced and hard-bitten psychiatrist is likely to be crouching under the table. You say, in 30 years of my practice, I've never listened to anything so frightening and so far out. Now, actually, if you told this story to a Hindu, he'd say, oh, yes, the third dream of Vishnu. Or, oh, yes, that's just like the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita.
Well,
we also have neurological and anatomical explanations for the so-called hallucinations of LSD. Hallucinations are not mysterious or supernatural. Hallucinations are the nervous system having experiences for which we don't have words.
It's the dying process of the psychological realm. It's the kind of dissolving of the perspective from which you're standing. That, to me, is one of the things that's happening while people are dying.
And then I feel you're catapulted out into non-conceptual space.
Yep.
Is that the way you're imagining it?
Yeah, exactly.
So is my sense of the continuity of awareness beyond the brain is just my wanting to keep something going? Is that?
I don't have that.
I know you don't have it.
Yeah.
And so
I'm curious.
What becomes into, you're curious. I'm curious
I'm
too.
very curious.
Do you use the word soul?
Soul.
Yeah,
All
you've
the
used it a
time.
lot. What do you mean by it? It's consciousness.
Super consciousness. And she hangs around the brain, not the sole of your foot. She's going to hang around the brain.
Well, Ramana Maharshi says it's right here.
In the heart. Oh, the
In
heart.
the heart.
I've had to tell 1,000 Hindu gurus that the heart is a wonderful organ to pump blood, and they haven't discovered Harvey's theory of circulation. They're using the heart as a metaphor.
Yes, they're using heart as a metaphor.
It's a very bad metaphor, I think.
They're using the lower right-hand corner, the size of a thumb. You
kidding me?
No.
Wow.
It's the size of a thumb.
Yeah.
It's called the hridayam, and it's right here.
It grows there.
It's right there.
Naturally.
It's there. It's there. It's not in a physical manifestation. It's, it's in a subtle form.
How do you contact it?
Well, you got to get better technology.
Well, see, better than LSD and better than...
Well, in LSD you saw all that, but it went by so fast and you didn't have a model, a conceptual model to save it. Just went through. Because so much went through every time I took acid. Must be for you too. That what we have conceptualized is the tiniest trivia of the edge of the whole thing, and that's why dying seems so fascinating to me.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because you're going like, like this.
You hope.
Huh?
It may not be that way. I hope it is. It's got to be that way.
You never know what will be coming down.
Can you have dinner with us afterwards?
I can't. I got to fly back to San Francisco.
Oh.
I'm working against a deadline for a deadline from
Yeah,
you, but working against a deadline.
How about the deadline? Yeah.
Speaking of deadlines.
Towards the end of May 1996, Leary began to show signs of kidney and liver failure.
I think some of his fears of letting go and not knowing what was next. Sure. I think that scared him. And I think he was, absolutely normal and understandably human in those moments. But the process of dying and actually, slipping into that unknown was incredibly beautiful for him. It was everybody else around that was freaking out. Ram Dass was really mostly there for us. It was the counseling he was sort of giving to us that was so precious and meaningful. It kind of got out of control. We probably had too many people around, and a lot of us didn't really know what we were going to do once he died.
And so I was talking to them about not talking to him, not trying to engage him, not trying to pull him back, but to let him be wherever he is. But they could talk among themselves in the room about all the beautiful things he'd done in life, which is like an old Tibetan practice. And I talked to them about working on themselves to not demand linearity, so that if he comes up with things from different places, to let their minds soar so they could be with him as his mind floated through planes of consciousness. And I told them to love death as much as they love life, to allow the mystery of the universe to be something awesome and beautiful.
He was letting go willingly. He wasn't trying to just hang on, even if the quality of life suffered. He was really going with the organic nature of things.
We haven't really created the right space for people not to be afraid during this moment that can be very frightening. But as Tim Leary said, I die so hard each time.
Timothy Leary's last trip began early on May 31st, 1996. He was surrounded by friends to the end.
Sometime in the last 7 hours of his life, he said, compadre, and then he said, esperando, I'm waiting, and then he said, follow, follow, and then he said, beautiful, beautiful, and then he said, flash, flash. Then he said the word why in a deeply moving way, why, and followed by an almost mantra-like repetition of the words, why not, why not?
Here in Southern California, the Harvard professor who became the outlaw acid king of the 1960s is dead. Dr. Timothy Leary advocated the use of mind-bending drugs. In recent years...
And there were 25 or 6 messages from CBS and CNN and ABC and And so I called the Washington Post and I said, yes. How do you feel about your friend Timothy's death? So I looked inside to see how I felt, and I said, fine. And there was this long silence on the other end of the phone. It was clear that they had written the material already, and I wasn't playing by the script. He and I have met in ideas and experiences and intuitive being together that is so deep that I can't imagine that I will ever think of Timothy as not being present. Timothy and I are explorers, we're beloveds, we're deeply connected to each other, and I can't imagine that that'll change. Flicker.
Timothy Leary made history one more time. Fulfilling his dreams as a futurist, his ashes, along with those of Star Trek's creator Gene Roddenberry, were sent into orbit. It was the world's first funeral in space.
There's no doubt at all that I will be around after I die.
Think for yourselves. Discover, explore, and treasure your own uniqueness. The proper study of a human being is yourself.
Tim's right. Go into yourself and then if you go in deep enough, there is truth. And that truth leads you to pick the people, the beings with whom you're going to spend your life and your death. If you have identified with your soul when you're alive, death, it's just another moment. In ourselves, it's all there. It's all there. God is awareness. So when we tune into our awareness, we close the space between the individual and God. You delve deep into the moment. You come to all and everything. One becomes the moment, the moment, the moment. One becomes love. Life and death are one. It's ecstatic. It's like becoming God.
Richard, you have enriched my life. I'm sorry, Ram Dass, you have enriched my life.
No, I can be Richard. Come on.
You've enriched my life, Richard, and I'm so proud of both of us. And I thank you for making this opportunity for us to make love in public.
Yes, exactly. 35 years we've been dancing like this. It's been a hell of a dance, hasn't it?
And we're totally different.
So
Not
different,
totally, yeah.
so different.
Great.
But that at this moment we so appreciate each other. Isn't that nice?
Big hug. Okay, there we go. Okay, cut.